Okay, folks. Hey there. We're back. Let's get right into the progressive era. So you'll see on the slides titled "How Progressive?" Question mark. That this era, which is now known as the progressive era, and the folks called themselves progressives and saw themselves as reformers, challenging the the difficulties of an industrial civilization that had really come online in the late 18th century, or late 19th century, with all of the problems of the labor question, and race and racism still dogging America. And the progressives are often not all that progressive when it comes to race, as we will shortly see. So there are, there are certainly elements that we might identify in this era as being progressive in the more modern sense that we use that term, in the more contemporary sense that we use that term. But in many ways, it wouldn't fit as a very progressive era, from the standpoint of the 21st century. I also just want to note kind of content warning that in the slides and in some of the remarks that I'll make, that I will be using some terminology that is historically accurate, and it's the terminology that people like W.E.B. Du Bois use. It would be considered offensive if this were being used in a contemporary text, but Du Bois is using it, and it's the same term that Martin Luther King Jr. will also use later, and so I think it is historically accurate not to alter the words that he is using, but just to note that this is, this would not be a usage that we would be, it would not be considered appropriate, in the present day, and so I will only be using this term when I'm directly quoting W.E.B. Du Bois. Okay, so if you move to the second slide, you'll see, I was raising this issue of the some of the real problems with the progressive era that continue on, and in a sense are just the inheritance of the failures of the Reconstruction era, that we have already seen with the rise of Jim Crow, the rise of a specifically racialized discriminatory order across the American South. But of course, it isn't just the American South. It's also across, even if states do not have formalized Jim Crow discrimination in place that mandates a separation necessary between white and black, separate facilities, separate water fountains, separate buildings, separate law schools, all kinds of things like this, separate railroad cars. All of that is enshrined, by the way. I think I didn't mention this on a slide, but all of this is enshrined in the famous Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson from 1896, which indicates that separate but equal can be the law of the land. So you can be given separate facilities, specifically separate facilities as an African American, and your equality is not being violated as long as you still have some facilities provided for you. But of course, the facilities, as we know, were never equal and were never intended to be equal. Okay, so we see. I just wanted to kind of note some kind of more general cultural aspects that are not, as I say, not just about the American South at all. And that is the way that a kind of resurgence of racism sweeps across the United States in the early 1900s. We actually see that in part this is actually created by this classic film by D.W. Griffith. You can see the poster for that film on the next slide, on the third slide, and it's a Klansman. It is a Ku Klux Klansman, and if you have seen, so this film, D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, is considered, along with Citizen Kane, among the two greatest films in film history in the 20th century. Great, not necessarily because of its content, That is because it celebrates the role of the Ku Klux Klan in sort of saving white civilization from the newly freed African Americans in the post-Civil War South. It absolutely turns the Ku Klux Klan into heroes 50 years later, right? So this is in 1915. But it's lionized in film history for a whole bunch of revolutionary techniques that it pioneers. So it's one of the first real feature films, and it really sets the template for how to tell a story in film history. So from a kind of formalist idea of what it is to be a film, it, along with Citizen Kane, are kind of regularly placed at the top of the 20th century. And yet it is just about as straight up racist as you could possibly be. And it's celebrated. So when I was growing up, and I first heard of this film, I remember hearing of it. I probably heard of it before I made it to university, but it was in university that I heard about it, and I had friends in film school, because we had a big film school at USC. We still have a big film school there. And so people would talk about this. No one talked, even though it is as racist as it could possibly be, it was just talked about as if you could talk about it just as pioneering in form and in, you know, narrative technique and cinematography and that sort of thing, as if the fact that it was a defense of the Klan was like it just didn't exist, like, so it just wasn't even mentioned. But I don't think we can talk about the film without talking about the Klan, and specifically the reason I raise it here. Obviously, this is not a class in film history, but it actually leads to a revitalization of the Klan. The Klan had been dormant. Ulysses S. Grant in the 1870s, President Ulysses S. Grant, who had been formerly general of the Union armies, had largely gotten rid of the Klan. As an outright terrorist organization, had intervened and had mainly squelched it. It is revitalized because of this film. This film revitalizes it, and it is widely celebrated. You see a number of so on the slide you see that this was the first film that was ever shown at the White House. This was shown in a Democrat, a progressive era White House film showing. Woodrow Wilson watches it. It leads to this revitalization of the Klan at this giant rally at Stone Mountain in Georgia in 1916. But you see as the racial violence that I categorize, where there were just these. So there were lynchings, which would take place as mob justice, vigilante justice, would take place across the country, mainly concentrated in the South and Midwest. Those were usually individual cases of individual African Americans accused of crimes and then just summarily killed. And these were big crowd events. You can find the images online. I'm not gonna put them in the slideshow. But it was just a big popular thing, and people were not ashamed to show up and to have their pictures taken, to participate in these things. And then there were giant mass violent incidents in which wholesale African American communities in cities in Oklahoma, so Tulsa, Oklahoma, Rosewood, Florida, Little Rock, Arkansas, and then Atlanta. So you see a number of these incidents. This is not even to mention, I don't have on the slide, that the only actual coup that ever took place in any American city was in 1898 in Wilmington, where the white residents overthrew a government that had a number of black representatives, and there was a large black community, African American community in Wilmington, North Carolina, and there was a violent coup that overthrew the city government of Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. So we see recurrent incidents across this era, and it's across many states, and it's not just confined to the South. One other bit of evidence that I just came across recently, just to connect with the sort of larger cultural imagery, or sort of larger cultural landscape, was an analysis by a film historian who was looking at short films that were done in the era, like the last decade of the 19th century, so like the 1890s. And this person the scholar looked at all incidents that they could find, all films that they could find that were classified as comedies, and these were often very short films. So in the 1890s, the films were very, very brief. But these were, shown in public places and theaters. So they weren't feature-length films like only really comes about later with D.W. Griffith. And they looked at hundreds of films across this decade. And every single comedy that they were able to find, in 100%, so there were zero exceptions to this, in every single comedy, African Americans were always depicted through highly racist, overtly racist stereotypes, and were the object of ridicule. And even when the sort of heroes of a story were African American, they were always depicted in very stereotypically stupid, as stereotypically sort of stupid and unintelligent, and they were kind of bumbling, through their lives. And this was just widespread, and these were the films that were shown. All of the comedies that were shown in the United States, apparently in the 1890s, there is not one that shows African Americans to be, kind of reasonable humans equal to the white population. So again, I just emphasize this to say, this is another piece of evidence to say that this is a widespread phenomenon. This racism is widespread across the United States, and that we see this in these cultural artifacts, films of varying kinds. Okay, so if you can go to slide number 4. So this is the world that W.E.B. Du Bois is responding to. I have on the slide there just a pronunciation note. So note, it's not DuBois. It looks like DuBois. It's not. He pronounced it DuBois, and so that is how it is said. So W.E.B. Du Bois. So I've got a little bit of additional information. I mean, there's some information in the textbook. Du Bois is just the most important African-American intellectual philosopher of the, well, he and Booker T. Washington are two of the most important, but really Du Bois, I would say, is the one that really stands out, and still people are mining his work today for not just insights on his historical period, but for thinking just about questions of race and racism, not just in the U.S., but more generally how to think about race and civilization through his writings. So, he's an activist. He's a professor, but he's not just a professor. He's one of the founders of the NAACP. He's involved in the Niagara Movement. And if you go ahead to the 2 slides after this, so 5 and 6, you'll see the Niagara Movement. He's there in the center row in the, I don't know, looks like a white hat, light colored hat. That's Du Bois. The Niagara Movement is one of the precursors to the NAACP. And if you go to slide 6, you see this is the Niagara Movement. So this is, an organization of primarily African Americans, but not solely African Americans, who are trying to combat this racist order that is the rule of the day in the United States. And not only were they in Niagara itself, but that picture, I think, is taken at one of the resorts on Lake Erie, so close. So, but in Canada, so they were often working and located here in Canada. So we have a local connection. St. Catharines, of course, was a terminus for the Underground Railroad, back during the Civil War. But even this, the precursor to the NAACP, has important links, historical links to our Niagara region. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So, Du Bois leads really a very active and interesting life. He's a leader in the Pan-African Congress, which is lobbying for independence of these European colonies in Africa in 1919. Of course, that doesn't really go anywhere. And again, he's trying to lobby the United Nations in 1945. His book, Black Reconstruction in America, is again a foundational work for thinking about the Reconstruction era, and for specifically thinking about the the kind of revolutionary character, potentially revolutionary character. And he had some Marxist, well, he very much thought of himself as a Marxist at times. And so he's identifying the kind of radical class nature of the African American population in the United States in the 19th century. But it's just a very rich work of history as well, even if you don't particularly buy some of the more overt class analysis that he brings to it. He's overtly persecuted, even in the 20th century, because he's an anti-colonialist, because he is lobbying for independence for various colonies in Africa, and because he is overtly communist. He is persecuted. His passport is revoked by the United States government. They hold it for 8 years, or confiscated for 8 years. He's not able to go to one of the key conferences, the Bandung Conference, which founds the non-aligned movement in 1955 that he was instrumental in organizing for. He is eventually able to leave the United States, and he ends up going to Ghana, and then and he's not a citizen any longer, and then he's working on an Encyclopedia Africana, and that's where he dies. So he had just a really, as I say, quite an interesting and contentious life. We are reading something from his quite early period, and of course while he was still in the United States. So the Souls of Black Folk, begins with this question: how does it feel to be a problem? So this is the next slide, on slide 7, and DuBois articulates really a classic version of sort of classic idea that people go back to again and again now for thinking about how it is to be, and here I'll use his term, how it is to be a Negro in the United States at this time in the early 20th century, where there is this, what he calls a double consciousness, where one thinks of oneself as both a Negro and as an American, but those two things are split. Those two consciousness is, I can't say that word. Those two identities are split, and so one feels oneself to be both at the same time, and that the two can't easily coexist. And of course, you can see why from all of the history of the racial order and the racially discriminatory order that I've been talking about. So he says it is to feel at once, to feel American and to identify as an American, but also to have this consciousness that to be gazed at, especially by white Americans, you are perceived as not American. Even if they might concede that you're American in some, technical sense, American citizen, you are still looked at as other, and you are looked at as a problem. You are seen as less than, as not just socially unequal and economically unequal, but as kind of fundamentally a kind of stumbling block for American, quote unquote, American progress. And so it's in particular, so the way he identifies these two consciousnesses, I said it correctly that time, kind of at war with one another, and that you can't eliminate the conflict as an African American. You have both of these senses, both within yourself. You think of yourself in both of these ways that are separate, and then you also absolutely are subject to the gaze of whites. GAZE, the always being seen as different, lesser than, and that this constant being observed from the outside and knowing that you are being observed from the outside is a constant, it's a constant eroder of self-confidence. So to have this double consciousness, to think of oneself as both as who you are, but then also the sense that your society views you as a problem. He says, there are a couple of different ways that this can manifest itself. So he lists these kind of 3. I mean, he thinks about outright violent revolt. This is one, possibility. Another possibility is submission, just an acquiescence to the racial order, to the racial hierarchy. A third he sees is a kind of what he calls a sullen cynicism. So you're not submitting, but you're not willing to revolt outright, and so you kind of acknowledge in a kind of depressed way that this is the way the world is, and so that makes you kind of nihilistic. You sort of live for the moment. You're not gonna challenge the racial hierarchy. You also know that it's unjust, and so you're not sort of giving in that sense. But it leads to this kind of world weary, depressed, cynical attitude, kind of nihilistic attitude. What Du Bois is trying to pioneer is a fourth way. He's trying to look for a way out, a fourth way where you engage the problem of the double consciousness and what it is to live behind the veil as an African American, but you try to struggle for some kind of rapprochement, or some kind of bringing together a kind of dialectical struggle between these two identities, in which you can somehow try to come to a kind of dignified self-realization. In and through the confrontation with these, with these warring consciousnesses. So if you go to the next slide, slide 8, so you can see that from Du Bois's standpoint, the Atlanta Compromise of Booker T. Washington that we've already discussed, for him, this is that second option that we discussed on the previous slide. This is a submissive attitude, to simply shut up about protesting racial injustice, protesting social injustice, social inequality, and as Washington advises, just to basically work hard at being important to the economy not through white collar work, but basically through blue collar work, through laboring in skilled trades, and not but making sure you don't present any fundamental political challenge, direct political challenge. Du Bois thinks that this is essentially an undignified way to proceed, that you can't have any kind of real pride. You have to give up pride. You have to give up your self-respect in order to adopt the strategy that Washington suggests. You would be giving up any kind of quest for equality politically, for African American political power, for civil rights, for higher education, all of that. You're giving up your self-respect. You're giving up your dignity, and so this is why Du Bois thinks this can never stand. This is a slave mentality, he says. And he says this is why someone like Booker T. Washington is very popular with whites, not necessarily with African Americans, although he will later become popular with some African Americans who do see that as kind of this kind of what Du Bois thinks of as a submission, but as it's a kind of way that maybe it's the only way. I mean, this seems to be the thinking of those African Americans who will agree with Booker T. Washington. So Malcolm X is going to take up this attitude, just for thinking about, we've already watched that Malcolm X interview, for thinking about Du Bois as he relates to the later 20th century. It's Du Bois's attitude is much more akin to Malcolm X's. So Malcolm X will describe the difference between what he calls, and again using the terminology that Malcolm X uses directly, the house Negro and the field Negro. The idea is that the slave who used to live in the house would accommodate him or herself to the wishes of the master, and might gain some kind of benefits, would have better food, would have better treatment, was maybe even considered kind of a friend of the household. This would be Samuel Jackson's character in Django Unchained. This would be a truly unflattering portrait if you've seen that Quentin Tarantino film. So that there is a certain path to gaining some kind of personal wealth and some sort of acceptance by whites to take that, again, Malcolm X's term, house Negro approach, as opposed to the field Negro approach, that is the person who is not in the household and who is willing to outright disobey, outright disrespect the master, and then will be punished very harshly. That's very much the attitude, or that's very much the heroic figure for Malcolm X, and this is similar to DuBois here as well. The idea that in order to maintain any kind of possibility for self-realization in the future, African Americans need to keep a hold on their dignity, and that dignity has to be, in order to have that dignity, you have to engage in open, not necessarily open protest, but certainly open activity to reclaim the dignity that has been stolen. And so, so just to kind of then wrap up our discussion of Du Bois, and I'm going to wrap up this video now, and then I'll talk about Emma Goldman and Herbert Crowley in the next video. Du Bois is still going to say, look, what he wants is Black and white America to come together, right? So he's not, in his discussion of the double consciousness, he never rejects the idea of eventually becoming American, or fusing the African American and the American, or as he would say, the Negro and the American, into a whole. He thinks that, in fact, America needs what he calls the second sight of Black Americans, that it is crucial for America, for white America, but for America as a whole, in order to actually, in order for it to actually live out the story that it believes it is living out, a story of liberty and equality, that it is the second sight, that is the kind of, ESP, I mean, to put it in sort of modern terms, that there is an important vision and visionary quality to the African American experience that has to be incorporated into the American experience as a whole, in order for the nation to actually achieve its kind of dream of being who America thinks it is. And so he is very much about, while criticizing this racial order, this racist order, he is very much still about trying to bring the two consciousnesses within himself, but also these two groups within, American society as a whole, to bring them back together. And he will still, cite the Declaration of Independence as an important inspiration in the close of this work. So, and I think we can see a lot of analogs with Nicole Hannah-Jones's work and the 1619 Project as well. And they are, Hannah-Jones is very much inspired by Du Bois. That's very clear. But again, it's this idea of, raising these critical aspects of American history, not as a way of, it's a way of criticizing America, but it's also a way of saying America, to be true to itself, needs to acknowledge this past, and there is actually a path forward for America to be this great place, and this place where, where one's freedom and where liberty and equality, where one's creed is not dependent on one's, biology, that it's based on the ideals that you believe in, that there is this future, possible future of possible freedom for all peoples. So again, there are these kind of idealistic and utopian aspects, and pro-American aspects, even in Du Bois, as critical as he absolutely is of America in its very recent past. Okay, so I'm going to close out Du Bois there. Next video we'll be talking about Emma Goldman and Herbert Crowley, and Eugene Debs. So a lot of socialism and anarchism, and then responses to that by the actual progressives. Okay, cheers.